The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
The book is the Living Memories Project, Legacies That Last. And it's a book in which it's a book designed for people who have had a loss, and it helps them to channel their grief into developing positive and meaningful projects for others or for their own families, such as scholarships or foundations, or something as simple as videos of a person's life or albums of the person's life. This is really something that Meryl developed, and she can talk about that. It was her idea to do this after the loss of her parents within a short period of time. Then my parents died soon thereafter during the course of developing the book.
The book was my idea, and I enlisted the support of Stewart and my brother to execute it because I didn't think I could execute it by myself. So my parents both died within a year and a half, and my mother was my best friend. She was my confidant. She was my sounding board. And I was having a lot of difficulty crawling out of my grief after really a couple of years. And then I remembered my mother's advice to me, and my mother was a very cheerful, optimistic person, and whenever I was sad or bored or depressed, she would say to me, get yourself a project. So I thought, I've got to get myself a project, and I want to learn from others, and I think a good project would be interviewing other people about how they kept the memory, values, traditions, passions alive of those they've lost. Because I came to the conclusion that there is no such thing as closure. Someone you love and lost is always going to be with you. They're not going to be with you physically, but they're somehow going to be there. So my quest was to find out and learn from others how they kept that memory or that presence alive in their lives, even though the person was no longer physically here.
We wanted to see how others dealt with grief, and so we started to look around and say, well, who has done something meaningful in their lives? And we started making calls. Meryl had just read the book Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, and so he had just died, Frank McCourt. So I called his brother, Malachi McCourt, and I said, how are you dealing with the grief of your brother who was so well known and whatnot? And it was such a great interview. It was such an upbeat interview, and that's in fact what the book ended up being. Very upbeat. It's not a down book. We're talking about grief and whatnot, but it's a very uplifting and comforting book. People who read it said it really provides a great deal of comfort because it gives them a way to say, okay, my spouse or my parents or my child had an interest in doing a particular thing, and this is what I want to carry on. I want to carry on that legacy through a memorialize them in some way, and that's a very a positive reaction to the death of a loved one.
Well, it was interesting. My father had been in declining health for about 10 years, and we knew that he wasn't well, and we did not expect him to live forever. So it was not really a surprise. We sort of, I guess, engaged in what they call anticipatory grief. We knew that he was going to die. And my mother was the caretaker, and my mother was just a very loving, generous, giving person, and she took care of my father. And we really expected my mother to live well into her 90s, because her own mother had lived to almost 90. And just very shortly after my father died, my mother sold the house they had lived in for 57 years and moved near us, and we thought was creating a new life. And 6 months after that, she was diagnosed with a very aggressive cancer, and she died 6 months after that. So it was a shock. It was just a total shock, and I was prepared in some sense to lose my father, but I was not prepared to lose my mother. And I was just so close to my mother, and I looked forward to really spending more time with her and enjoying her. So and then I felt, we were just starting to have grandchildren, and our kids were getting married, and so she was going to miss all that, and it was weighing heavily on every experience that I had, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I knew that I needed to do something to lift myself out of my grief. And I have to say that this was a very cathartic, therapeutic process. I learned a tremendous amount from the people we interviewed, and it did provide me with a lot of comfort.
We were surprised, I was surprised by the reaction people reading the book have found that it's very comforting to them. They said that it gives them good ideas. We've done a number of programs in which my wife and I described the book to groups of people, and people have come up with us and said, I'm not thinking about a loss right now, but I want my father to put on tape some of his stories so that my children and grandchildren can learn from it. We were in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we did some television out there. One of the people in the book is Nick Clooney. Nick Clooney is the father of George Clooney, the actor, and the brother of Rosemary Clooney and Betty Clooney, the singers. And we did some television out there and got a call from somebody at the local JCC, the Jewish Community Center, and said, we've just built a legacy wall. And we want people who have been major supporters of the Jewish community to do a videotape, talk about why they did what they did for the Jewish community, and talk into a video. We're going to put it on the wall, have pictures of the families, so that not only their children but future generations will see who were the builders of the Jewish community. And it's one large family. We're all in together, and these are the people who are the founding fathers, so to speak. When we approached people and said, how do you remember so-and-so, we particularly wanted to get people who were killed in the World Trade Center. We wanted to, these are traumatic events, so we did that, and we talked to people that way. We also talked to people in Israel. We talked to Sherry Mandel. You may have heard that her son Kobe, a 13-year-old boy, was killed by, they believe, Palestinian terrorists. No arrests were ever made, but it's widely believed that that's what's happened. And so she said to us, and it was really a critical comments that she said. She said, you always carry the pain with you. It's always going to be there. Grief is energy and power, and you have to harness it. If you don't do something, it will destroy you. You have to find something within the love you have for a person to continue. There is still power in the soul if you can tap into it. Maybe not the soul, but in the love you have for that person. And you can take that love and use it to create something from the destruction. Just like Noah, who goes out after the destruction and creates. And so we thought these things are so powerful, and that I believe when people read them, they say, wow, maybe the passions and the values that this person stood for, that they loved, can be shared with others. And that's really what they've done. in many cases here. They set up foundations, they set up scholarships. But as I say, people have done very simple things. I called Jack Klugman shortly after Tony Randall died. You remember they were on The Odd Couple. They did many programs and shows together. And I said, how do you remember Tony Randall? He said, oh, I put his picture all over the house. And when I pass this picture, I remember where we were when that was taken, and it brings back good memories, and it's very comforting to know that. And that was something very simple like that. Leon Charney dedicated the book. It's called The Mystery of the Kaddish. Its profound influence on Judaism. And Leon, when he started going to the minyan each day to say Kaddish for his mother, Sarah, he said it provoked, it raised a lot of questions in his mind. He wanted to find out why the Kaddish, what's the history behind the Kaddish, and he started looking in books. There was nothing written out there. So he did his own research. I believe he said he investigated and read something like 45,000 pages of material to in the course of doing the research for the book. And in researching the book, he says, he talks about Kaddish, and we did a video with Leon talking about the book, but he also said to us that for the purpose of this book, he said you're supposed to say Kaddish in unison at the synagogue and not shout it out and then run out. You have to make it an internal experience in your life. If you just mumble words and run in and out, you don't get the same benefit. The fact that you're going to say Kaddish makes you feel good, and the fact that you're studying makes you feel better. And he says, I'm firm in my feeling that an unfortunate thing in life, such as the death of a parent, can catapult people into learning more about their religion. And that's exactly what happened in our family when Meryl and Arthur's parents died. Arthur really took off from that, and he'll tell you about that.
I had the luxury of, I say now, the luxury of living as far away as I did, because when I would come to visit my mother probably every other week for a while, and then toward the end, every week I'd come up for a couple of days, and it was a 2.5 hour ride each way, and I did a lot of my grieving in the car. You know, by the time that our mother finally passed away, I had pretty much. I was pretty much spent as far as grief was concerned. We were told when we started researching the book, I talked to Dr. Dan Gottlieb, who's a family therapist in Philadelphia, has a syndicated radio show. And the first question I asked him was, what about closure? Isn't what we're doing with this book the exact opposite of closure? And without a moment's hesitation, he said, there is no such thing as closure. And there is no such thing as closure, and I still feel the loss. One of the interesting things I learned from the book is that we talk about preserving memories, and this book is not really just about preserving memories. It's about preserving personality and preserving spirituality and preserving wisdom through the use of memories. And people talk about, Stewart mentioned Malachi McCourt talking about his brother Frank, and what Malachi said at one point was they have a saying in Ireland, death is not fatal. And by that he meant that people are often kept alive through story and through song. And we find that throughout this book, we find one person after another saying, I felt someone's presence here. I felt, if it's a wedding, I felt my mother's presence. And I'll read one excerpt here. This is Arthur Kurzweil, a leading Jewish genealogist. And he told us, he said, for me personally, my great-grandfather is more real to me than you are. I certainly feel his presence. It says in the Talmud that your teacher is closer to you after death than during life. During life, he is in his place and you in yours, but when he's dead, he is no longer restricted by geography. He can be with you all the time, and many people have found this to be true. The soul existed before this body and exists after this body, And I have come to believe in these things, to know these things. I've spent more hours with my great-grandfather than almost anybody. I grew up imagining about him. These are people who are alive.
I think that the idea that the Kaddish is, nothing is said about death in the Kaddish. It's an affirmation of God.
Right.
And we think that it's the fact that you have to say it with a minion. That's what brings about community. You can't go in your house and say it alone. You have to say it with a minion. You have to say with 10 people. And that's really what I think the power of the Kaddish is. The fact that you must say it with a minion. And as you point out in the book and in the TV interview, that people, they don't just walk away. The 11 months are over and they don't leave. They stay on past the 12 months, past the, well into the, some people have stayed on, for years afterwards, because there's such a bond there, there's such a tie, and they don't want to give it up.
Stewart mentioned Leon Charney's book about the Kaddish, and it's interesting because when my father died in 2005, my sister and I both felt the need to do something. I thought about how deeply he felt about his Jewish heritage. And even though I was not a religious person, I thought it would make sense for me to go to Minyan every day and to say Kaddish for 11 months. I think that was something that would have made him happy. And what's interesting is now 10 years later, I still go to Minyan every day. I have become very much involved in the life of my synagogue, and I consider that a gift from my father because of the person who he was. Being a writer is a solitary existence for the most part, and I spend much of my day by myself, not talking to anybody. Sometimes I answer the phone, and that was not a good place for me to be right after I experienced the death of a parent. So I began going to Minyan, and I found this community out of nowhere. There were these people who were there for me every day, and it was a great feeling. And I don't know how I would have gotten through that death without it. Also,
from the book, I learned about the fact that the rabbis were afraid of losing the Jews because there was the plague. We're talking about 1069, I think the year, I forget the exact date, but the Black Plague, and the Christians had churches to go to, but the Jews didn't have any place to go. The Kaddish was reserved just for the priests, and so they decided to open it up, and that's how the Mourners Kaddish came to be. Very interesting that they did it to keep the Jews together. Fascinating, fascinating. In Judaism, the name is critical. And when you do something in someone's honor, memory, that's great. And also in Judaism, we keep alive names. And we name someone after a deceased, a relative, particularly a parent. And Meryl and I just were blessed with two new grandchildren, making 5 now, and they were both named after our parents. And it's said in Judaism that the belief is that death is not absolute, doesn't put an absolute end to an individual's existence. If you keep that person's name alive and on earth, the spirit of the dead then are able to attain enduring nearness to the living. And that's one of the reasons why we do that. Also, there's a phrase that someone said, the Yiddish name for grandchildren is Einikel. And in Hebrew, that's a combination of 2 words, Ein Kol. There is no destruction. Thus, we are our grandchildren, and our grandchildren are us.
People only die, as someone in the book said, if we let them. That we can keep them alive. We can keep them alive in our memories, in the way we behave, in our values, in our actions. It's a question of celebrating who they were, remembering them. I consider it my mission to keep my parents alive. In fact, one of the things I did, and it was an idea that I got from a couple of the people in the book, I established a scholarship in memory of my father. My father was a principal in the Brentwood Public Schools, which is a high-need district out in Suffolk County. And every year for the last 4 or 5 years, they have a scholarship awards night, and I go there with hundreds of other people who are also dedicating scholarships in memories of their loved ones. And I get up and I speak about my father, and I talk about his values, and I talk about what kind of the person he was and what kind of principal he was, and I'm able, I present the scholarship to young people, and I'm able to help them in his name, and that's very, very satisfying.
And just as it says that the branches of a fruit tree will lie on the dead branches below it, so too do we believe that we're building on the lives of our ancestors and keeping alive their values, their passions through various projects and works. And that's really what the book is all about.
Leon Charney sets out to discover the true meaning of the Kaddish, the Jewish custom of reciting a prayer to commemorate the death of a close relative. Join Charney as he finds out the history of the Kaddish and how it has evolved. Reviewed as a refreshing walk through Jewish history and a book that deserves to be read by both Jews and non-Jews, The Mystery of the Kaddish is now available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at audible.com or on iTunes. Discover the mystery of the Kaddish.
The Leon Charney Report congratulates the team of BDC, The Price of Peace, and Leon Charney on the New York Emmy Awards win. The documentary reveals the true story of the negotiations leading up to the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. Watch it on Hulu.com or buy the special feature edition DVD at select stores.
Now get the book the hit movie was based on, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the backdoor channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels. Get best-selling author Leon Charney's latest book, The Battle of the Two Talmuds. Join Charney as he explores years of Jewish history to find out why and how Talmudic scholars and rabbis abandoned the Holy Land for the lands of the diaspora. Learn about the power struggles behind the creation of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. It's a book critics call engaging and enlightening. A book which will be of interest to people of every faith. Now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or download the audiobook of The Battle of the Two Talmuds at iTunes or audible.com. Available now over iTunes, Amazon, and Google Play. Leon Charney's cantorial CD and Disco Lam. Listen as Charney movingly sings El Moleh Rachamim and Charney's amazing rendition of a disco remix of Adon Olam, all sung in the incredible and individual Charney style. Also listen to the CDs on Rhapsody. Download Leon Charney's cantorial songs and Disco Lam, the disco remix of Adon Olam on Amazon, iTunes, and Google Play. Or listen in on Rhapsody. All available now.
Yisgadosh, Yisgadosh, Shemei Rabo. Different rendition of Kaddish, and you can see by reading this book, if you do buy the book or somehow your friend gives it to you, there are many different cantorial versions of Kaddish. So stay tuned for our interview. I'm now on the other side, and Professor Laor is going to ask me all the questions. And you notice when I get serious on the show, I wear the glasses, so I'm ready. Welcome, Professor Laor.
Welcome, Leon.
Nice to be at my own show.
Leon, it was a privilege to be in your book party yesterday. It was such a heartfelt and heartwarming event. Everybody loved it. I spoke to many people after the event, and everybody loved the words, the atmosphere, as well as the book.
It's real ironic to celebrate a Kaddish book, isn't it?
But you opened the show with the cantorial music.
Right.
Where have you inherited the cantorial music from?
From my father's genes, probably. I think to be a cantor, you can study voice, and you can study projection, and you can study all different musicology. But I think most cantors, good cantors, are born, and they have to have that certain trill in their voice that they're able to get. And as a kid, when I was about 9, 10, I used to pick up a Jewish prayer book and create my own tunes. And then you learn all those roles, which are very difficult to do.
Extremely difficult.
Neil Diamond choked on it 6 times trying to do Kol Nidre and Jazz Singer. But we Jews are strong, we overcome.
Are you still performing?
I sing every so often at some synagogues in New York, sometimes at weddings for friends. I wouldn't say the Internal Revenue has to check my box on income on that, because usually I do it as a gesture of charity. But I do sing a lot, yes.
Yeah. And about this book, Leon, how did you get interested in the topic? Seems sort of unrelated to what you're doing.
Well, spirituality helps. Unfortunately, my mother had died, and I had to sit Shiva, which is the 7 days of mourning that Jews partake in. And I had to face this dilemma of going to the synagogue twice a day, every day, for 11 months, sometimes 7 in the morning, 8 in the morning, and 3 at night, whenever sundown came. And so you have to correspond your life to a regiment which you're really not used to. And I was not against it, but I was wondering why we Jews do it. And I got very curious. So I spoke to a few rabbis, and I said, well, who authored this Kaddish? Why are we saying this Kaddish? And what does it mean? Is it for death? Because I knew Kaddish had nothing to do with death itself. And I didn't have an answer. So I met my co-writer, Saul Meislish, who's an Israeli religious journalist who had written a book with Rabbi Laor, the chief rabbi of Israel, on Jewish tradition. And I thought, well, he's a scholar, I'll ask him. And he said, it's a mystery. So I said, okay, why don't we write a book on the mystery of the Kaddish, which is what we did. 3 years later, it's a nice book, hopefully.
Ever since you raised the question, I was going around asking. Talmudic scholars, everybody had the answer. Oh, this is a traditional prayer. It's for the Talmud. And your book refutes it.
Well, they didn't think it came from the New Testament, did they?
But nobody knew the answer.
Nobody knew. I've made more money on this book by having people bet against me than I will in selling royalties probably on this book. I know. I went to yeshiva 98 years. I study every night. I go to Kollel, which is a learning group. I study from 9 to 9, and then I take a break. I have coffee. I go back. I know. Everybody knows. I said, I bet you $20, $100, $50. They came back. No one knew the answer. So I got a whole income out of betting on who knew the Kaddish.
Maybe for the audience that doesn't know anything about the Kaddish, maybe you say a few words about it and translate a few words from the Kaddish.
Well, Kaddish is a Kaddish. It's said by Jewish people who want to mourn their relatives, mainly fathers, mothers, and brothers, could be sisters. And it's the ultimate praise of God. It has nothing to do with death. The real question that arises in the Kaddish prayer is, if God is omnipotent and unctuous and He controls, or He or she controls, I don't want to get into the philosophy of God, then why do people pray? This is a question you should answer, probably.
Why people pray?
Yeah, if God, it's all in a sense predestined, that God cannot be questioned. Yiskadal Yiskadash, we accept God for what he or she is and cannot question him. So why prayer?
There are a few answers to this. One would say to change the decree. The others would say to change themselves, so the decree would be on the previous person. So the changing of one's heart is the purpose of prayer.
It's the eternal question, and I'm sure during the Shoah people asked this question. During the Holocaust, I'm sure this was a perennial question. I think I asked it of Elie Wiesel when he was on the show. And it's a fundamental question, but the Jewish community does pray. I think one of the interesting aspects of Kaddish is that you need a minyan, 10 people to pray. Why can't one pray alone for his father's soul or his mother's soul? And the concept, in my opinion, was the concept of keeping a Jewish community together. And in the Jewish community you had a rabbinical authority, and therefore you had rabbinical tradition that was transferred from generation to generation. This is my own opinion.
In the Kaddish, the last lines refer to the fact that the Lord, the name of the Lord, is beyond all blessings, hymns, or consolation. So there is no hope for consolation and meaning in the world. So one should accept one's lot.
Right.
That's it, period. So it's sort of an irony.
Right.
You may want to pray, but you won't find any answer. So it's the ultimate acceptance.
So then there's a psychologist, psychiatrist, maybe you can answer that. You pray for your own sense of serenity or solace or some way to exert some psychological energy. I don't know. I mean, that's a good question.
But there is a clear statement there that this name is relegated to the transcendence, and you cannot expect any answer. It's the answer of God to Job, that you cannot expect any answer to the meaning of suffering in this world. And for our generation, a post-Holocaust generation, it's a great prayer, very important one. But Leon, have you gotten any answer? Who wrote the Kaddish and how?
Kaddish, no,
a very long voyage. I was
there is no singular person that I know that wrote the Kaddish. The Kaddish came about basically around 1096 when the Crusaders were massacring Jews, and then you had the Black Plague and the blood libels, and there was some kind of prayer that the rabbis, the elitist rabbis, were saying, but the ritual did not come down to the individual ordinary person. And in the Christian religion, there was the ability for those people who had suffered death to memorialize their dead people. And I think what happened is there was a merger of the Talmudic passage with the Christian ritual, and this became sort of a universal prayer for the common man in Judaism. So it took away the elitist, where the rabbis only would say some kind of prayer or Kaddish, and allowed the whole, and every person as a person needs to ventilate his or her grief, and so it became a universal prayer.
So what you are saying, and this is very crucial, that till that time, 1096,
around that time,
only scholars were mourned or memorialized by reciting the Kaddish, and ever since then ordinary people were included, and Christian rituals, including ordinary people, were endorsed, and Jewish texts, Talmudic texts, were adapted to this effect.
Right.
And this way rabbis could democratize religion.
Yes, and it was called Chukat HaGoyim, that the rabbis in that period of time, when we talk about in the book, Chukah means the law of the non-Jew, looked at the law of the non-Jew, which in general Jewish principles it's frowned upon.
Right.
but they needed to do it because they needed to satisfy the emotions of the community. Now, whether they said it only for rabbis or the rabbis said it only for disasters is something I think happened both ways. We're not clear. Maybe we should find some evidence in it. But there are other interesting things in the book where we show that the basically Ashkenazi, which was the German Jews, took this program of Kaddish, and we'll talk about it after the break, incorporated into the Sephardic community. The Sephardic community wrote it in a book called the Shulchan Aruch, which was a set table, and then it became part of the Ashkenazi. We'll go through that whole rigmarole, so to speak, and it's fascinating. I don't think most people have thought about it in those terms. So we'll be right back, and Professor Laor will continue to probe me about why I wrote this book on Kaddish.
Leon Charney sets out to discover the true meaning of the Kaddish, the Jewish custom of reciting a prayer to commemorate the death of a close relative. Join Charney as he finds out the history of the Kaddish and how it has evolved. Reviewed as a refreshing walk through Jewish history and a book that deserves to be read by both Jews and non-Jews, The Mystery of the Kaddish is now available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at audible.com or on iTunes. Discover The Mystery of the Kaddish.
The Leon Charney Report congratulates the team of BDC, The Price of Peace, and Leon Charney on the New York Emmy Awards win. The documentary reveals the true story of the negotiations leading up to the greatest diplomatic achievement of our time, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. Watch it on Hulu.com or buy the special feature edition DVD at select stores.
Now get the book the hit movie was based on, Leon Charney's Backdoor Channels. Learn about the backdoor channel negotiations that led to the historic 1978 Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. Become a witness to history and order Backdoor Channels online at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Also available at all other retailers and booksellers. Or download the audiobook at iTunes or audible.com. Relive history. Order Backdoor Channels. Get best-selling author Leon Charney's latest book, The Battle of the Two Talmuds. Join Charney as he explores years of Jewish history to find out why and how Talmudic scholars and rabbis abandoned the Holy Land for the lands of the diaspora. Learn about the power struggles behind the creation of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. It's a book critics call engaging and enlightening. A book which will be of interest to people of every faith. Now available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or download the audiobook of The Battle of the Two Talmuds at iTunes or audible.com. Available now over iTunes, Amazon, and Google Play. Leon Charney's cantorial CD and Disco Lam. Listen as Charney movingly sings El Moleh Rachamim and Charney's amazing rendition of a disco remix of Adon Olam, all sung in the incredible and individual Charney style. Also listen to the CDs on Rhapsody. Download Leon Charney's cantorial songs and Disco Lam, the disco remix of Adon Olam on Amazon, iTunes, and Google Play. Or listen in on Rhapsody. All available now.
Yizkadah, Yizkadah, Shemei Rabo, You maybe remember that Kaddish that I believe you could attribute to Southern Elah, and that's the last Jewish prayer on Yom Kippur. My producer, Arnie Mazer, is always in his synagogue on Elah, and he could probably hum that song. I'm not sure he could sing it, but we'll test him later too. We're back with Professor Nathaniel Laor. We are talking about Kaddish, the mystery of the Kaddish, the Orphan's Kaddish, a book written by yours truly, and Saul Meislish. It will be translated, by the way, in Hebrew with the very famous and noteworthy paper there, and the largest one, the Yediot Achronot. It's a fascinating journey that took me over 3 years to, I guess you never complete study, so just at least to get this book out. But Professor Laor was extremely helpful to me, so he should really be asking me the questions today and see if I've been a good student.
Leon, so you were mentioning that the Kaddish started in Europe, 1096, over the period of a few hundred years, And then you were referring or alluding to the fact that the tradition migrated to Spain. How did it come about?
There was a rabbi in Germany called the Rosh, and Rabbi Eli Asher, and he lost his wife and son, and so the community began to say Kaddish for him. And the Rashba, who was the chief rabbi of Spain, had a position available for the Rosh in Spain. Now Spain was Sephardic, and the Rosh came from Germany, which was Ashkenazi. And he found the spot where he became a rabbi in Spain. So you have an Ashkenazi rabbi under the chief rabbi, so to speak, of Spain. And unfortunately, the Rashba died. He was a great luminary in Jewish history. And the Rosh became the head of the Sephardic community as an Ashkenazi Jew.
In Toledo. It happened in Toledo.
Toledo. Yeah. And many of you may know or not know that ultimately this Kaddish was written into what we call the Shulchan Aruch.
First of all, the Tur. His sons.
Tur. They're basically 4 books that try to codify the regulations of how Jews should practice on a day-to-day basis. And not that he's a great scholar, I hope I'm correct. The first was the Mishnah Torah by the Rambam. And then there was the Tur.
Yeah.
And then Rabbi Karo, who was a Sephardic Jew, and then the Ramah.
Before all of them was the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Elfasi.
And he wrote?
He wrote this was Talmud Katan, it's called. Okay?
Small Talmud. And these books would try to regulate how you should behave as in all your endeavors as a Jewish person.
Right.
And so Rabbi Karo, who was a Sephardic Jew.
So first of all, you were mentioning the Tur, which was Jacob, the son of the Rosh.
Of the Rosh. He wrote. There were 4 books for the Tur, right?
Right.
And this is a practice of life. And after the Tur came Rabbi Karo, very famous. Most Jews today accept Rabbi Karo's book as the Shulchan Aruch, which is the way of life, and most Orthodox Jews practice that. In order to transform that into an Ashkenazi halacha, which is a law or ritual, the Ramah, Rabbi Isserlis, came and made some commentary and sort of coordinated his position with Rabbi Karo, and that's the standing book today in Judaism.
This is how East and West came together.
And so we bring that out in this book. And as I say, the book is not only about Kaddish, but it's a lot of history of Judaism. And I think it's hopefully quite interesting to people to understand this whole evolution, because it's very important. I believe, by the way, that Kaddish is a Kabbalistic prayer. Do you?
You mentioned in the title the mystery, and there is the notion that there is an effect on the soul of the deceased. And I remember while you were writing, I was asking you the question: how is it that one can hire a Kaddish sayer? A proxy.
Right.
It seems odd. Can one hire somebody to bury one's relative?
It's one of the few instances in Jewish law where you can do that.
Yeah, right.
And the wonderment...
Can one hire somebody to pray for you? We are instructed
I don't know.
to
Some
pray
guys are
3
trying
times.
to hire me as a cantor.
No, but we have to pray 3 times a day.
Right.
Can I hire somebody to pray for me? This not.
No.
But Kaddish, yes. Why is that, Leon?
I think it's such a fundamental aspect of Judaism that it's a connection that one can keep even though they do it by proxy. That's my opinion.
It's like hiring a doctor to care for the soul of the deceased.
Right. That's an exemption, though, in Jewish law, isn't it?
Right.
And but that comes about by the elasticity of rabbinical authorities. I mean, probably, maybe there are people who could not say the Kaddish every day. Probably there was guilt about doing it. We're not talking about millionaire bond traders who have to get in 7 in the morning and are afraid to take off 15 minutes. By the way, I've met thousands of people who didn't believe they could alter their schedule to say Kaddish and go to shul and to the synagogue and change it. And they all did, amazingly. Even at the party last night, I met some very prominent people who had unfortunately lost their parents. And people you would not believe, and no names here obviously, told me they just finished saying the Kaddish. And the Kaddish was supposed to be for 12 months, but there's also a Kabbalistic reasoning that it's for 11 months. Do you remember that, Nati?
I remember, but the truth is that I don't remember why 11 rather than 12.
Something about the death and redeeming the dead people, and
before the end of the year.
Before the end of the year. It's fascinating, and it's very Kabbalistic, and it's integral to Judaism, by the way. You can be conservative, Reform, or Orthodox. Basically every Jew who has a Jewish burial is confronted with this issue of saying Kaddish. I've been in Reform temples where you know, great men are being buried, and you may hear the organ play the Kaddish with a soloist, but every funeral would end with a Kaddish.
You mentioned in the book Sneh.
Oh yeah, Sneh was the former minister in the Labor government. He's now a member of the Labor Party. His father
was a communist, right?
His father was a communist, and his father was a nationalist and not a very religious Jew, but he was an atheist. But when he was on his deathbed, he told his son, who is living today, and he's in the government, to say his Kaddish for him.
This ties into your view that it has to do with community, with Jewish community life.
Right. It was integral. I mean, Ezer Weitzman, who was not a very Orthodox Jew, every year would go to the unveiling or the Haskara, which is a memorial day for his uncle Chaim Weitzman, the president of Israel, and he would say the Kaddish. Interesting, in Israel, as you say, a lot of nationalistic Jews can't even recite the Kaddish. One of the great problems for the burial of one of the great men in Israel, and I'm not going to mention a name, was who would say the Kaddish, whether the son could say it, and they were practicing for about 20 minutes. This is in Israel, where they know Hebrew, how to pronounce the words, because Kaddish is written in Aramaic, and that's Babylonian, because
it was the lingua franca at the time.
Right, the language of the Jews in those times, because as you will note in here, the Talmudic, the Babylonian Talmud overtook the Jerusalem Talmud, so the words are written in Aramaic. Very few people understand that one either. So you have a whole legend here of ideas and concepts that come out of sim. I meet people say, what's so big about the Kaddish? How can you write a book about Kaddish? It's 3 words. You feel guilty about your parents, or you say the Kaddish. I said, suppose you're not guilty. Suppose you just want to honor you. Who honors their parents? I go to see a shrink. So that's why you're very busy. I mean, it's such silly remarks when people really don't know and don't understand, and they make it simple. And the real question is, how can no one else attack this problem? And I don't know the answer.
Well, it seems, after having read this book, the answer seems to me rather clear. Those who study halacha, they read in the Tur, the history. The Tur refers very clearly to Rashi's school, to other schools.
These are all scholars.
Scholars
These are rabbinical scholars.
In France and in Germany. Right. All kinds of traditions, and he has to decide, and he decides on his father's, the Rosh, and Rashi's tradition. So there is something very hopeful about this, Leon, and I got a lot of hope about Jewish religion reading that book, because I read the halacha, but I never connected it with the Crusades.
Halacha, we have to explain to the audience, is the rabbinical interpretation of what basically the Torah, which was the 5 books of Moses, gave to us after they studied the various ways to integrate it into society. So let's say in the Torah it says you shouldn't cook a kid in its goat's milk. I mean, literally, so how many people are going to cook a kid in goat's milk? But that came kashrus, that no milk and no dairy are together. If you go to one community, you wait 3 hours between dairy and meat, some communities 2, some 6. the big thing on Passover. Everybody gets all excited. They think they became Talmudic scholars because they found out that the Sephardic Jews eat rice. Do you think this was the revelation of the discovery of the world? It just shows that there are different cultures who attack the Judaic principles in a different way. So you have this halakha, which is a standard that is set by these rabbis. And incidentally, the book goes very thoroughly into the different cultures and different minhagim, customs of how to say the Kaddish and when to say the Kaddish. I remember when I was in a Sephardic shul on the holidays, they would not say the Kaddish for the dead. Are you aware of that in the Sephardic shuls?
Yeah, but still, the Tur and Rabbi Karo decide very clearly that you may say the Kaddish on the holidays. Which
really, I was not allowed to in the Sephardic shul.
Because it's a concession to popular psychology. The festivities waive all mourning customs,
right,
but the Kaddish. So for me it's something very hopeful that rabbis catered and attended very carefully to the needs of the ordinary person, and that customs help shape halacha, that it kept developing. It's something hopeful for these days.
This is one of the few times where custom and ritual became halacha. And this is one of the innovations, or something that we really talk about in the book. And it's interesting. Halacha is the fundamental law. And the Orthodox rabbis always talk about halacha. You cannot...
It's like eternal.
Eternal. You can't fight it. And it basically was cut off at a certain period of time. Now the conservative Jews moved, in a sense, forward. They became more progressive about it. And there was a fellow named Geiger in Germany in about 1850 who started the whole reform movement. And what's interesting about the German Jews, the word Yortzeit, which a lot of people practice, which is at the memorial service for a parent or a brother or sister. It's the time of the year. It's a German word. Yor means year, Zeit, time of the year. And it's a German word, by the way, and it was a German custom. They used to memorialize their dead on those days, and they had lists that they would read in the church. So it was a lot of cross-culture between all cultures, mainly monotheistic cultures in any case. So the book, I hope, gives consolation to anyone who is going through the process of mourning, and gives them at least an understanding of why they would partake in saying the Kaddish and obligate themselves to say the Kaddish or not. By the way, women are allowed to say the Kaddish in conservative minyan, egalitarian minyan it's called, and obviously in Reform, Reform have their own practices. I'm not believe they say it every day, but one never knows. These practices can change all the time. And we find in the book that in Germany, Orthodox women, when there were no male heirs, were able to say the Kaddish. You remember that in the book?
Yes, of course.
So that shows elasticity also of the rabbis. It's interesting why Germany was so predominant at that time.
Enlightenment. Because of the Enlightenment.
Moses Mendelssohn,
Haskalah, the influence of Immanuel Kant, Rousseau, Kant, and the rest of the Enlightenment period. So Jews had to react to this and to liberalize. They wanted to be part of the advanced world. The reaction to that was the ultra-pious counter-reformation.
Which was
a Haredi, Khatam Sofer, which was a movement that continues to this very day to counteract the Haskalah, which is the Enlightenment.
Professor Laor, I thank you for coming on, for helping with this book. I think and hope that this book will really, as I said in the beginning of the show, give comfort to those who really are curious about Kaddish, and it is an integral prayer of the Jewish religion. And all of us are confronted by this situation because unfortunately everybody is confronted by death sometime in his life. and the question of how to memorialize or honor parents or relatives, etc. We are lay people, so we are not giving you any rabbinical interpretations here. I'm sure if you have any big problems, you should talk or speak with your local rabbi or someone that you look up to. Or if you're curious, you should study and write your own book about Kaddish. I remember some rabbi asking me whether he or she could drive on a Sabbath because conservative Jews do it. I said, why would I answer that? You're a rabbi. Go look in the books, check it out yourself.